My name is Doug Madory from Kentik. So I've done a bunch of reporting over the past couple of years about the developments of the war in Ukraine on the internet. I didn't have anything recent, so I didn't want to cover stuff that's already been covered, like Kherson and the changes in registrations. I thought it'd be worth giving you guys a presentation on something I've been working on with RPKI ROV. This is a preview of the presentation I'm going to give in at NANOG in a week, and it relates to internet security in Ukraine and anywhere in the world. So this story begins back in January. So there was an outage in Spain. Orange España was one of the major mobile operators in Spain, experienced an outage on January 3rd. It got a lot of attention. We wrote up a blog post digging into the impacts of this. And the headline at the time was that there was some sort of improper access that caused this outage. And what had happened here was that a hacker had stumbled upon the login credentials for the RIPE NCC portal for Orange España, and was able to use it to log into their RIPE account. And once in, this person decided to just start causing problems. And the way they ended up doing it was to get into Orange España's RPKI configuration, which had not been used up until that point, and start creating ROAs intentionally to cause outages. So now at that time, the RIPE NCC portal had no two-factor authentication. As a result of this incident, that policy was changed within a day or two, and no traffic was misdirected or data was compromised. However, many Orange España routes became unreachable due to the filtering that takes place these days of RPI invalid routes. And this outage marked the first time that we saw RPKI ROV used as a vector for a denial of service. But to understand why this outage took place, we have to understand the state of RPKI ROV adoption. So let's take a step back and look at that. So we recently published another, myself and my friend Job Snyder's of Fastly have published a couple of pieces in the last couple of years, another one in the last couple of weeks, going through the latest on where we are with RPKI ROV adoption. And I'll go through that quickly. So just to back up, so RPKI ROV, this is our best mechanism to protect internet routing from mistakes, typically just accidental originations or leaks. Occasionally there's intentional stuff that gets protected, but it's not designed to be foolproof. We have enough problems or mistakes on the internet that we need a system that protects internet routing from our mistakes. And for this to work, there has to be two steps. One step is that the resource owner, the company that owns the IP address space, has to create a ROA, so route origin authorization that asserts what is the correct AS that can originate an address range, the correct maximum prefix length. And then the other step is that we need ASs around the world to reject routes that get evaluated as RPKI invalid. And so those are the two areas that we measure adoption. And last year, Job and I wrote up a post and on where we stood like last spring, and we made this bold prediction that if the state of growth of ROAs continued, we ought to see it become the majority case in a year from now, because we're writing in May 2023. We thought it would be May 2024, just going off this graph from NIST, which is a U.S. federal agency that measures routing security. So we extended these lines out and predicted this would take place in May, and I even posted some polls on Twitter and LinkedIn to see, you know, where people thought this was going to take place. Where was this crossover event going to take place where the majority of V4 routes would have ROAS? And by the way, V6 is already there. That happened in the fall of last year, so that they're already a majority case of routes with ROAS and therefore valid. But everybody was very pessimistic. The belief is that this is going to maybe never come or come much later than it did. But you know, we saw this take place on May 1st because we were watching day by day. And so now, these days, we have the majority of V4 routes in the global routing table have ROAS again, according to the NIST RPI monitor. So the piece of analysis I did a couple of years ago for NANOG was to look at, you know, how could we look at this in terms of traffic levels? So I work at a company, Kentik, that deals a lot in NetFlow. We do NetFlow and analytics as a service, and I can pool all that into one big pool to look at, you know, make statements about the internet. And so what we did at the time, this is 2 years ago or over 2 years ago, we were at about 1/3 of BGP routes at ROAS, and but when I put it into our traffic stats, we can see that it was over half of the traffic in bits per second were going to routes with ROAS. So actually we were farther ahead than we had thought. And the explanation there was that there were a lot of eyeball networks, basically residential broadband providers, as well as content providers. So in the United States, we had Comcast and Spectrum as our major broadband providers, and then we have Google, Amazon, Cloudflare, a lot of content provider companies that have done RPI deployments. And so while those companies may constitute a small portion of the BGP routes, they represent a very large portion of the traffic due to what they do. That was the explanation. And so now that we've gone from 1/3 BGP routes, the question was like, how does this look in traffic stats? And we see this continuing to increase. So now, you know, if February 2022 was 1/3 of BGP routes at ROAS and half the traffic in bits per second went to routes with ROAS, now we're seeing, you know, just cross this threshold where 1/2 of BGP routes have ROAS, and now we're seeing over 2/3 of traffic in bits per second is going to routes with ROAS. So that's, you know, more evidence of the progress that we're making. It's likely the case that this increase is going to plateau as there's just fewer gains to be had, or the folks that aren't creating ROAS are, you know, have legacy address space or have some other issue that it's harder to resolve. But you know, we'll get into what this means. But again, it's more progress for this our main routing security mechanism. And then I dug into some of the data for Ukraine. So if you were to look on the right-hand side, this is from the RipeStat tool. If you were to plug in Ukraine to see in V4 percentage of address space covered by ROAS, you'd see 58%. That's pretty good. For V6, it's 32%. And then if we put into our traffic stats, you know, how much traffic we see going to Ukraine that is going to routes that are valid, we call it valid traffic, then that is 69.9%. So it's very high. Unknown is 30%, which are routes that don't have ROAS. And then there's very small slivers of routes that address traffic going to routes with that are either persistently invalid or they're invalid, but there's a covering prefix, and it was too small to even bother writing in this graph. So on the flip side of that, you know, if we create ROAS, these are useless if there's no networks rejecting invalid routes. And so again, we went in 2022. Job and I looked at, you know, how to measure this. It's a trickier thing to figure out how which ASs are rejecting invalids. It's very challenging to do this. So what we did was look at, using like a public BGP repository, using route views. We looked at how far do routes propagate based on their RPI evaluation status. And so we arrived at this graph where both V4 and V6 look very similar. The x-axis is how many BGP sources, like in so we call vantage points in route views, can see a route. And so you see there's a peak where globally routed prefixes all exist at one spot, and then there's a few that are seen by fewer peers, but that's basically where global routing is. It looks identical for either a RPI valid or a not found route, because not found is also neither of those are going to be filtered. And then there's always a set of RPI invalid routes at any given time, usually due to misconfigurations. There's always persistently invalid routes, and we use those to try to measure like how far this propagation is. And in this green distribution, again, both for V4 and V6, we see really suppressed propagation, reduced propagation as a result of ASs rejecting invalids. So the question is, so this was from 2022, how has this changed since? And so what we tried to do is look at the median propagation of a RPI invalid route, and how did that change through time. So we see it's a tricky thing to do. We can see a decline. This graph is showing a decline in the route vantage points, seeing the average propagation of invalid routes. Now, this analysis does have some challenges, like the set of persistently invalid routes is not guaranteed to stay constant. Propagation also is heavily influenced by which providers a route is going through. So it's a little bit problematic to just put it all into a big pile like we're doing here. So to explore this, to see if this trend holds up, we thought we'd look into some of the intentionally RPI invalid beacons that have been set up, both by RIPE in V4 and V6, and then Job has his own RPI beacons. And so in this graph, what we're looking at is on the left, these are RIPE V4 beacons. The blue is valid, the orange is invalid. The number of vantage points and route views grows, but then the propagation slowly declines in for the route views vantage points as more companies are rejecting invalids, or an invalid route propagates less. The same thing holds up for V6. And then there's also Job's announcements, which are essentially the same information, just announced from a different place. And then he has two different invalid routes that he's announcing in slightly different ways. We'll talk about that slightly. So the two different invalid routes, what's happening here is that he's announcing one is in the Iryna tall and one is in the RIPE tall, and there's a difference in the two RIRs, how they the Iryna requires this relaying party agreement that some providers have refused to accept. There's a lengthy legal agreement that you have to agree to, and so as a result, there are fewer providers that are accepting the Iryna tall. They'll accept everything else, but not the Iryna tall, and that means that the things that are invalid in the Iryna tall or Iryna published by Iryna are going to propagate a little more because there's fewer ASs rejecting it as a result of this relaying party agreement. So that's an issue for Iryna to work on. It's been an issue for many years that people have complained about, and but we're beginning to put some data to the difference that we can see in the operational internet. So on the flip side, we also have some news to report on the rejecting of RPI invalids. So, a lot of this reduction that we're measuring is as a result of those tier ones that are rejecting invalids. So we're talking about like NTT, Lumen, Aurelion, that's what it's now called, Cogent. These companies rejecting invalids, and they have an outsized influence on how routes propagate through the internet. So even if it's a small number of ASs rejecting invalids, certain key ASs can have a big impact. And so we were down to basically two tier one ASs or transit-free zone ASs that were still not rejecting invalids up until recently. And now we have Zio has begun the process of rejecting invalids across its large global network. And we saw that start to happen on April 1st, so that we expect to see that distribution of RPI invalid routes to continue declining as more larger networks start rejecting invalids. We're kind of left with Telecom Italia now as the last major tier one that is not rejecting invalids. And so hopefully if they can do that, if they can start rejecting invalids as well, then we would expect to see a lot of reduction in the propagation of invalid routes. So coming back to the Orange España hack, why did this, how does all this information that we just discussed have any impact here? So so this hacker gained access to, again, Orange España's our NCC network, rendered its routes invalid. Again, if AS were not rejecting invalid routes, then this would have had no effect at all. So the fact that so many tier one ASs and other ASs are rejecting invalid routes means that if a route is changed, if a row is changed that invalidates a route, then that route is going to not be able to get circulated, and as a result, won't be able to carry traffic. And so that ultimately, the progress that we've made in RPI ROV was closely intertwined to the cause of the outage. It couldn't have happened if ASs were not rejecting invalid routes. So there's a couple of calls to action here. So one is, I think these stats should support any provider's decision-making in deciding whether they want to deploy RPI. Ukraine is doing a very good job. I think we saw 58% of V4 address space covered with ROAs. We're seeing 69% of the traffic going to Ukraine, going to routes with ROAs. That's good on the ROA creation side. I guess the two pieces are, given the majority of BGP routes have ROAs, including a super majority of traffic as of recently, that ought to incentivize the network to reject the invalid routes to avoid mistakenly egressing traffic, sending traffic out incorrectly based on the acceptance of misoriginated routes. On the flip side, given the fact that there's so much rejection of invalid routes out in the internet, this ought to be increased incentive to create ROAs that would enable the rest of the internet to look out for the routes on our behalf. And so there was, I have this graphic here from the early days of following the Russian invasion, when there was a Russian crackdown on independent media. In that case, one of the Russian providers decided that they would block Twitter by locally hijacking Twitter address space and black holing the traffic. But they mistakenly announced it out to the internet, and so some other providers picked this up. What's interesting is that this prefix was identical to the prefix that Myanmar had announced and hijacked in a similar process 1 year earlier. But the difference between then and this case was the fact that Twitter, now called X, had rolled out RPI and created ROAs for all of its routes, and so that enabled the rest of the internet to understand what's the valid route from Twitter and what's the invalid route from the Russian provider that's hijacking it. And so in the end, the propagation was very low. Like in this graphic, you can see there's a very thin red line along the bottom. That's how far the hijacked route got. It didn't get very far. So, this was both an intentional and a mistaken, incident. But something like this could happen again, and this would be, again, incentive to create a ROA, allow other providers to look out for your routes in an automated fashion, so you don't have to get involved if there's a hijack, accidental or otherwise. So, the progress that's been made here, it's resulting from the dedicated efforts of hundreds of engineers, many companies, including many Ukrainian engineers. Improving the global security of the internet. This is not a small. It's not a small task. This is going to take many years. There are a lot of pieces to this, and this is just the first of many initiatives. So, lastly, RPI ROV doesn't solve all of these issues. I like to say that there's a constellation of different problems that we face. This is more on the simple side, the fat finger type of error, and we have some other bigger issues that we want to address as well. But we had to begin somewhere. The RPI ROV can be fooled. There's ways to get around it. If there's what we call a determined adversary, then someone can defeat RPI ROV. It does make things harder on them, but the most interesting cases lately have been these hijacks that involve BGP hijacks, sometimes involving defeating RPI ROV to go after cryptocurrency services. Those are demonstrating currently the weaknesses in our current internet routing security posture, and where we need to focus our efforts going into the future. But the fact that we made such progress in ROV is something we should take some time to applaud ourselves and the work that we've done so far. So that is my presentation, and I'll happily take any questions.
When you expect that without proper RPKI records, just operating on particular prefix will not be possible? I mean, it's not going to work.
Maybe,
okay, so that's the question. When you expect that, let's say, major telcos in the world will just do a filtering, we will reject the prefixes which are not properly signed?
Yeah, I think, okay, the question is, sorry, I have to turn my sound down. Okay. The question is, will we get to a point where ASs are also rejecting routes without ROAs? I think is the question, and kind of beyond just that it's invalid, just that it doesn't have a ROA. And I don't think that's something we want to do. So I think one of the design constraints of any of these routing security initiatives is to try to break as little as possible. We want things to be backward compatible of the internet. If it becomes too destructive, then people are going to not want to participate in this. So I think we'll just encourage ROA creation, encourage rejection of invalids, but I don't think anybody involved in this project is advocating that we reject routes without ROAs.
Thank you.